All right, good evening. Thank you for watching this virtual lecture event hosted by the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security and international affairs. We have 5 master's degree programs, 18 certificates of study, and a new doctoral program. If you're interested in learning more about us, please visit iwp.edu. This evening, we'll be hearing from Mr. James Rice. Mr. Rice is the Legislative Director for U.S. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, for whom he has worked since June 2000. In this role, Mr. Rice serves as the Chief Advisor to Senator Grassley on foreign policy matters, including in Senator Grassley's capacity as co-chair of the Senate Baltic Freedom Caucus. Mr. Rice's previous professional experience includes positions in the Iowa Senate, an internship with the British Conservative Party, and work on various political campaigns. He has been recognized by the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs for his contributions to public diplomacy. Mr. Rice received a BA from Drake University with majors in political science and history and an MA in Statecraft and International Affairs at the Institute of World Politics. Mr. Rice, welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining this event on Baltic security on what happens to be the 103rd birthday of the modern Republic of Lithuania. So it's an appropriate time. So my research is focused mainly on Estonia, but there's also a lot of shared history between the two or the 3 Baltic nations in the 20th century. So much of what I'll talk about is broadly applicable to Latvia and Lithuania as well. And I'll start first of all with a disclaimer that first of all, this talk is based on academic research that I performed outside of my professional work, and I'm speaking entirely on my own behalf. And also, I should add that I've had no official briefings or classified or unclassified on these subjects. So this is all based on open source academic research. And also, I'll be talking a lot about history because I think understanding Estonia's modern history is crucial to understanding Estonian society and the government of today. And the same is true for Latvia and Lithuania. Estonian foreign policy places great importance on its NATO membership and its membership in the EU and its bilateral relationship with the United States. And that's no surprise to anybody. But there's certainly historical roots to that. In addition to just their geopolitical situation, during World War II, the Baltic countries were neutral and didn't have any viable allies with which they could rely on. Sandwiched between Nazi Germany and Soviet Union. And so they got rolled over 3 times. They had 3 occupations, first by the Soviets, then by the Nazis, and then by the Soviets again, which, of course, lasted 50 years. And you could contrast that with Estonia and Finland are, culturally and linguistically very similar. But Finland had a different experience. It was able to fight off in the Winter War the Soviets, and they lost part of their territory, but maintained their independence. And then they took they have historically had a different attitude toward neutrality. So you hear about the term Finlandization. And sort of Estonia's experience is very much one of, wanting to have allies and trying to join as many, whether it's the NATO alliance or any kind of multilateral club that provides some sort of tie to other allied nations, other like-minded nations. And so it's also, what I'm going to be talking mainly about is that Estonian military strategy also contains elements of a society-wide national resistance concept that dates all the way back to the Estonian War of Independence, and also informed by the anti-Soviet resistance period following World War II. This total defense principle is an important complement to the NATO Article 5 security guarantee, and it's something that is important for allies like the United States to take into account when planning security cooperation. So I'll do kind of a brief overview of the history, or maybe not that brief, but in the War of Independence, Estonian armed forces included both the newly formed Estonian Army as well as a union of armed citizens, the Kaitseliit, or Estonian Defense League. And I think of that as roughly like the Continental Army under George Washington and versus the colonial militias. There's one that's sort of a regularized army and one that's more a citizen-based armed force. and together they fought off both the Germans and Soviet Russia in an improbable victory that, two big powers at the time, that they were able to fight them off. And then on February 2nd, 1920, Soviet Russia signed the Treaty of Tartu, in which it recognized the independence of the Republic of Estonia in perpetuity. Their idea of perpetuity isn't what I guess other people would think, because that didn't last. But in the interwar period, Estonia and the Baltic states found themselves sandwiched between an increasingly assertive Soviet Union and a resurgent Germany. So despite their apparently similar predicament, the geopolitical concerns of the Baltic states at that time diverged. For instance, Lithuania had an ongoing territorial dispute with Poland over its historic capital, and that region, Vilnius, or Vilno in Polish, which was controlled by Poland at that time. And so that made a cooperation with Poland, which would have otherwise been logical, with the three Baltics, more difficult because of the situation with Lithuania. And also, Lithuania was concerned about German interest in reclaiming Klaipėda, or Memeland in German, which it was historically controlled by Germany but had a large Lithuanian population. On the other hand, Estonia saw Soviet Russia as its primary threat and didn't really view Germany as the primary danger to Estonia's independence. So on the kind of either end of the Baltics, you have a slightly different emphasis. Still the same threats, but some differences that made cooperation more difficult at that time. In addition, you get pride and national feeling amongst newly independent countries that sometimes get in the way, and that was something that actually Russia and Germany tried to play them off each other. And even if they'd been able to work out closer cooperation, there were other barriers to close Baltic coordination. For instance, each country had sourced its weapons differently, and so they were not interoperable. Then you have a situation where the Soviets were demanding a security arrangement with the Baltics, where they insisted that the Baltics allow Soviet troops on their territory in order to defend against Germany. But the Baltic countries had, again, no allies or treaties to secure their independence, and naturally they were reluctant to allow Soviet troops on their territory because the conditions that the Soviets were offering, they rightly saw as threatening their sovereignty. And then in 1939, you have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And that, of course, contained a secret protocol dividing up Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. And the Soviet Union was ultimately assigned the Baltics plus Finland, and eastern portion of then Poland, and the region of Bessarabia in Romania, or modern-day Moldova. And according to the historian Tovo Ran, the contents of the secret protocols were well known to the Estonian leadership within 3 days of being signed. Still, when the Soviet troops started massing on the border, the Estonian government determined that military mobilization was both impractical at that stage and risk provoking the Soviets. And so they did not mobilize a military defense. And the Soviets renewed their push for a security agreement, and they even upped their demands. They sought military bases with Soviet troops stationed on Estonian soil. And the government ultimately agreed to negotiations, and similar thing happened to the other two Baltic countries. The President Pats argued that not only was resistance futile, but that it might endanger the continued existence of the Estonian people as a whole, which at that time, not knowing what the future could hold, I suppose that's a rational argument that if you have a small country and they could just be entirely annihilated. Of course, we now have the benefit of hindsight. However, you also the historian and former anti-Soviet dissident / former Prime Minister Mart Laar, who's done a lot of research on all of Estonian history, including the resistance movement. So a lot of my research is based off of his original research. He maintains that most Estonians and some of the military supported rejecting the Soviet demands. And he notes that the commander of the Estonian army, General Johan Laduner, named the commander of the Defense League, General Orasama, as his successor should he die, because he expected that by that time Estonia would be in the midst of a partisan war. And so the society was prepared to resist, and there was some preparations for resistance, but the political leadership chose not to call for or command the military to resist. So when the country itself failed to fight, hundreds of young Estonians fled to Finland to fight the Soviets as part of the Winter War, and they planned to return later to fight for the liberation of their own homeland. And once Soviet troops were on Estonian soil, they set about disarming the population, including the Estonian Defense League. However, some members managed to hide their weapons in preparation for organized resistance later. And then a new pro-Soviet cabinet was formed, followed by elections where only Soviet-approved candidates were allowed. And that illegitimate parliament then, quote-unquote, requested to join the Soviet Union, and Estonia became a Soviet Socialist Republic. However, the annexation of Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania was never recognized as legitimate by the United States and other Western countries, and we maintained diplomatic relations with the three Baltic countries throughout the occupation. So the Soviet occupation of Estonia was incredibly brutal. Political arrests began even before the annexation became official. Large numbers of Estonians from all levels of government and civil society were deported to Siberia and or just executed. So entire families with young children and pregnant women were labeled bourgeois class enemies and sent to gulags. Most of those that were deported in that first year of Soviet rule didn't survive that first winter in Siberia. So this led to the first Estonians hiding in the forest to avoid deportations. Once word got out, people who were at risk of being deported fled to the forests, and they formed armed bands that were called Forest Brothers, and that's a term that pops up in all three Baltic countries. So when the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union, a number of Estonians in the Finnish armed forces returned as part of the reconnaissance group called Erna, which was beginning to organize the Forest Brothers to drive out the Soviets. And then when the Soviets started to retreat from Estonia, they attempted to conscript Estonians into the Soviet military, which led more Estonian men to flee to the forest. And then this was the beginning of the partisan movement aimed at restoring Estonian independence. As they retreated, Stalin ordered a scorched earth policy. He formed so-called destruction battalions, and that kind of went through the countryside, trying to just basically destroying any signs of resistance or just destroying everything in its path to leave little for the Germans. And then the Estonians fought both the destruction battalions and the retreating Soviet troops in hopes of liberating their country. And they hoped that the Germans would allow them to resume their independent statehood. But it soon became clear that a restoration of the Republic of Estonia was not part of the Nazis' plans. The German occupiers attempted to recruit Estonians into the German military, but then when that voluntary response was unenthusiastic, they resorted to conscription, which is a violation of the international law and during warfare. And this led to thousands more Estonian men fleeing to Finland, just like before, and they joined the Finnish armed forces and fought the Soviets. Meanwhile, the Soviets had left behind a network of agents in attempting to organize their own communist partisan resistance to the Germans, but that attempt fizzled for lack of popular support. Then when the tide turned and the Soviet military advanced on Estonia, many Estonians volunteered to fight alongside the Germans in order to keep the Soviets at bay and restore independence once the Germans had retreated fully. And then when it became clear the Soviet rule would return, the remaining members of the legitimate Estonian government issued Order Number 2, which called for the organization of Forest Brothers units to resist the Soviet occupation. So they, with the official stamp of the government. The deportations resumed when the Soviets were back in control, and they targeted any Estonians that had fought the Red Army or otherwise cooperated with the Germans, or anyone deemed a threat to Soviet control. And this led to many more Estonians joining the Forest Brothers. At first, the Forest Brothers pinned their hopes on the Western Allies demanding restoration of Estonian statehood. Per the words of the Atlantic Charter, they had read that, and they were familiar with these sort of proclamations from Western countries that a country should have self-determination, and they took it to heart and thought that that meant that United States and other Western countries would come and liberate them or insist on their independence. So, meanwhile, the Forest Brothers would just harass Soviet authorities intermittently, but they avoided large-scale engagements because they were preparing for an uprising in support of what they thought was an impending attack on the Soviets by the Western Allies. And obviously, that wasn't going to happen. That wasn't in the plans at any point. I actually had a Lithuanian diplomat once tell me that there was a common phrase that was used in her family that when someone was waiting for something kind of for no reason, they would say, "What are you waiting for? The Americans to come?" And that's because they had this memory of this time where they thought, well, soon the Americans will come and help liberate us, and they were just waiting for that to happen, and it, of course, never happened. And that's it's something that as an American I have mixed emotions about. Obviously, that wasn't a practical thing, but the fact that the country looked at America as a beacon of freedom and saw that naturally they would be defending their right to an independent country is sort of tugs on the heartstrings. So I should also mention, since we're talking about Lithuania, that the Lithuanian Forest Brothers was the largest, most organized, and most sustained resistance. And so, according to one source, they killed about 4,000 Soviets. So they did a lot more active resistance. All three countries had Forest Brothers that fought Soviets. The Lithuanian effort was more widespread and more sustained. So then at the Potsdam conference, they ratified the deal made at Yalta, and that's kind of when the Forest Brothers realized that liberation was not imminent, and they began organizing meetings to discuss a change in strategy for the long haul. The Forest Brothers recognized the need to coordinate and to develop a more centralized command structure. So initial attempts to do that were crushed by the Soviet secret police, but then the Armed Resistance League was formed in 1945 and 46 as sort of a blanket organization of most of the Forest Brothers bands that lasted until about 1948. And it had a program of action that stated, quote, "The organization is preparing an armed uprising against the Soviet regime at such a time when England and the United States go to war against the Soviet Union or when a political coup occurs in the Soviet Union itself," end quote. So the Forest Brothers attacked Soviet shipments of money and goods and then would distribute them to independent farmers that were often being coerced by excessive taxation into joining collective farms. And that those attacks were also meant to assert their authority to the population and dissuade collaboration by killing Estonian collaborators and punishing Soviets who repressed Estonians. However, the Forest Brothers scrupulously avoided injuring innocents and would not confiscate private property. By the end of the 1940s, the collectivization of agriculture in Estonia had significantly undercut the Forest Brothers' base of material support among independent farmers. Mainly, they relied on being able to stay briefly in a barn or get food from the farmers who were sympathetic to their cause. And once the Soviets had successfully collectivized agriculture, they were sort of on their own, and it was much more difficult for the Forest Brothers to sustain living in the forest. So the last major battles between the Soviet authorities and the Forest Brothers occurred around 1955 and 1956. And then you had the Hungarian uprising, which was crushed, and that further dashed the hopes of the Forest Brothers of a successful uprising like that happening in Estonia. But even after the armed resistance period was over, the impact of the Forest Brothers remained really strong and important. So Martlar paraphrases the mission of one of the resistance organizations as, quote, "To fight an ideological battle, inspiring faith in the restoration of Estonia's statehood, deepening contempt for the occupation authorities, and maintaining people's will to resist," end quote. So the fact that the Soviets feared the psychological influence of the Forest Brothers well after the last ones were eliminated is shown by a booklet published in Tallinn in 1980 titled "Blood-Soaked Traces of Bourgeois Nationalism." And it's available, it's in the Library of Congress. The publication painstakingly recounts the history of the Estonian armed resistance to the Soviets, but with a pro-Soviet spin, clearly intended to blunt the impact of the historical memory by trying to spin it as something that's against the interests of the people. But then in a booklet that Martlar wrote on the anti-Soviet resistance, he quotes one of the last Forest Brothers explaining why he did not give up, even when it was clear that resistance to the Soviets was futile. Quote, "And what was this drive that forced us out, the last Forest Brothers, to stay in hiding? I'll tell you, we knew that as long as we were still breathing, holding a gun, and feeling Estonia's soil beneath our feet, everything was all right. We knew that our captured comrades had it much worse. We knew that we were booked for a one-way ticket to Siberia. We knew that a bullet from our own gun would save us from enemy torture, end quote. And then Laura goes on to add that this was the attitude that saved the soul of Estonia, and it was the spirit that urged the Estonians to restore their independence in 1991. So since its initial independence, Estonia has been a small nation surrounded by aggressive great powers, and therefore unconventional warfare has necessarily been part of Estonia's strategic calculus from the beginning. Now, naturally, Estonia's geopolitical position has improved substantially from the interwar period in that Germany is an ally and not a threat, and Estonia is part of NATO and the EU. But on the other hand, Russia's aggressive behavior has caused renewed concern in Estonia, and well before many in the US were really paying close attention. So in 2007, when the Estonian government moved a Soviet World War II memorial of a bronze soldier to a less prominent location, to a military cemetery instead of right near the Freedom Square, the Russian media stirred up the local Russian-speaking population with inflammatory hyperbole and lies about that they were desecrating the war graves, or they were going to melt down the monument. They had Estonian government, media, and banking websites were subject of severe cyber attacks, which the Estonians were able to recover from, and they're now experts in cybersecurity. But then in 2008, Russia invaded and occupied 2 regions of the Republic of Georgia, which they still occupy. And then, of course, we have the operations against Ukraine in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the ongoing military intervention in the Donbass region. And in response, Estonia has updated its defense policy to address the heightened possibility of Russian aggression. And given the small size of the Baltics, they can't possibly match the military forces already in Russia's western military districts. So NATO plays a central role in defense planning, of course. And Estonia's strategy in case of Russian invasion is essentially to hold off the initial attack as long as possible until larger NATO allies can mount a response. But an often cited 2016 report by the RAND Corporation analyzed the correlation of forces in the region and determined that NATO was unprepared to defend the Baltics against a Russian attack, with Russian forces being able to reach the outskirts of Tallinn in 60 hours. So even with the presence of Allied tripwire forces as part of NATO's enhanced forward presence designed to deter a Russian miscalculation, and a conventional military defense of the Baltics cannot currently stop a full-scale invasion. So that report I mentioned, and then more recent reports by the Jamestown Foundation and the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments have come up with different formulations, but they all come to the conclusion that a considerable increase in conventional forces is needed for a credible deterrence, a conventional deterrence. And even then, that just raises the cost and changes the calculation for Russia. It's hard to imagine NATO forces of such size that could actually match the forces that are across the border in Russia. And if Russia should decide to launch a concerted, sustained attack, even an enhanced force would not be able to hold off an invasion forever. So, given its history, Estonia's defense planning doesn't rely solely on conventional military defense. Estonia's first defense chief after the restoration of independence issued General Order Number 1, which still stands, and it calls on all Estonian defense forces to provide active resistance to any aggressor without waiting for orders, unless ordered otherwise by the elected president. So that's kind of aimed at the situation before, where, except in that case, the president said not to resist, but it foresees a situation where for instance, there could be a decapitation attack, or there could, or basically the default is that there'll be resistance. There shouldn't be any question on the part of Russia that the plan A is resistance no matter what, unless something changes. It isn't a question of will Estonia resist this time or not. It's there's this general order on the books that says yes, there will be resistance. And there's a very good another report from the RAND Corporation from 2019 that kind of fills in the picture by discussing the deterrent effect of the concepts of resilience and resistance. that we're discussing here. And this includes that total defense concept involving the whole of society to both deter aggression and raise the cost of action while providing support for a conventional military defense. So all male Estonian citizens between the ages of 16 to 60 have a constitutional obligation to take part in the national defense. And then there's the Voluntary Estonian Defense League, which was restored in February 1990 before Estonia fully regained its independence. And that plays a key role in the defense strategy as well. Since Russia's aggression in the region, the numbers of volunteers for the Estonian Defense League, the Kaitseliit, have swelled, and it's becoming very popular for Estonians to join that and participate in the military training that it offers. And it's increased its training and preparation, including for unconventional warfare in the event of an invasion. And the Defense League is structured regionally so that local units have responsibility for territorial defense without having to be part of necessarily a nationwide coordination. The Defense League is sort of like an armed reserve, but it's got elements that don't fit in with the sort of wartime structure. And then there's a New York Times article that quoted a previous Defense League commander, quote, "The best deterrent is not only armed soldiers, but armed citizens too." And he goes on to explain the guerrilla activity should start on occupied territory straight after the invasion. So, end quote. A Defense League member is then quoted as saying that, quote, "Partisan war is our way. We cannot equal their armor. We have to group in small units and do a lot of destruction to the logistics convoys," end quote. And then this is my favorite quote from the then commander of Estonia's Special Operations Force, Riho Tegi, who was quoted by Politico saying, quote, "There are always these discussions like, yeah, the Russians can get to Tallinn in 2 days, maybe, but they can't get all of Estonia in 2 days. They can get to Tallinn, and behind them we will cut their communications lines and supply lines and everything else. They can get to Tallinn in 2 days, but they will die in Tallinn, and they know this. They will get fire from every corner at every step." And incidentally, General Utegi is now the commander of the Defense League. So if the Ukrainian intervention is a template, a Russian incursion is likely to start with a hybrid operations involving the so-called little green men that are not in Russian uniform. And Estonia's defense planning envisions using guerrilla units from its special forces or the Defense League to respond at all stages of warfare. So hybrid operations during an invasion and resistance in the event of an occupation. The ability to engage in and sustain and this kind of unconventional warfare is itself a deterrent, and I think a significant deterrent. And this has been recognized by NATO and the U.S. military. For instance, there was an exercise called Trojan Footprint, where the U.S. Special Operations Forces simulated providing covert support to the Estonian Defense League and its Baltic counterparts in fighting a resistance war after a Russian invasion in the weeks before a full NATO counteroffensive could be mobilized. And I know that U.S. Special Forces have also done training with the Lithuanian National Guard specifically. I've read an article on that, and there's just last December, I saw that a U.S. Special Operations site was opened in Riga, Latvia, that was funded in part through the European Deterrence Initiative, and that will allow U.S. Special Operations forces to move quickly into and operate in the area. So naturally, again, conventional NATO forces remain central to Estonia's national defense strategy, but the national defense strategy also states, quote, "The basis of Estonia's national defense is the Estonian population's strong will to defend their country, which is in turn based on national self-awareness, self-confidence, and dignity. Estonia will defend itself in all circumstances and against any adversary, no matter how overwhelming. Should Estonia temporarily lose control over part of its sovereign territory, Estonian citizens will still resist the adversary within that territory," end quote. And I would add that assertion is also backed up by polling data that shows Estonian citizens are ready and willing to fight if needed. So Estonia has learned its lessons from its history. Its unfortunate strategic isolation and lack of allies in the interwar period had tragic consequences. So naturally, joining the European Union and NATO were key early goals in order to secure economic and military integration with the West. And in fact, Estonia seeks to be a model ally and has long met NATO's 2% of GDP expenditure goal. And Estonian troops have fought valiantly in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq alongside American and other allied forces. So, and then while cultural and political differences remain between the Baltic states, this situation is much different than it was in the interwar period. Their shared experiences have resulted in a similar outlook, and they cooperate very closely in foreign relations and defense matters. So, despite the decisions of the political leaders and the lack of preparation and organization back in the interwar period, the resistance of the Forest Brothers took tremendous manpower for the Soviets to suppress. And it was the wholesale collectivization of agriculture that really ended their base of support. I think one of Marlar's works is called "The Forgotten War." It was a major war that the Soviets had to fight in the Baltics against the resistance, despite not necessarily always being well coordinated and prepared. And efforts by the West to link up with the Forest Brothers were often intercepted by double agents, and so that was never a successful attempt to link up between the Allied secret services and the Forest Brothers. To my knowledge, there was a number of attempts that failed with tragic results. So the same society-wide will to fight for independence that was seen at that time is still evident today in institutions like the Estonian Defense League. And that fact should give Estonia's large eastern neighbor pause before considering a repeat of its behavior elsewhere in the region. So Russia is still bogged down in a quagmire in the Donbas region of Ukraine. Russia may have overestimated the potential support of local Russian-speaking Ukrainians and underestimated the willingness of Ukrainian government and military to resist. And certainly they have resisted, and it has increased the sort of national awareness in Ukraine, and I think Western support should continue to make sure that the Russians pay a price for that. So Putin should be under no illusion that any action against any part of the Baltics will be some sort of cakewalk. They are ready this time, and he can expect a fierce, sustained resistance by the whole population, supported by the U.S. and NATO. So, and I'll let me go back to Lithuania briefly, given it's Lithuanian Independence Day. This is Lithuania has put out three booklets for its citizens about what should happen in the case of some sort of invasion or national emergency. Some of the early ones were more focused on, like, what to do, how to survive, how to avoid getting confrontation with them. This is the third one. It's not available in English, so I have not been able to read it because I don't read Lithuanian. But my understanding is it's a lot more focused on the military resistance side of things, and you see that there's pictures of Russian armored vehicles and there's there shows you what the different arms that the Russians have. So that is, again, both useful in the event of some sort of little green men operation, and also a deterrent. It sends a message to Russia that if you try anything, it's not just the Lithuanian military or whatever NATO forces are there. It's the entire citizenry is prepared for that. And so what are the takeaways for U.S. policy? U.S. policy should take the Baltics' unconventional warfare strategy into account in its material support of Baltic security. This includes considering the different training and equipment needs of the Defense League and its counterparts in Latvia and Lithuania when planning U.S. military assistance. Continued exercises like the ones I mentioned that practice potential real-time U.S. support for partisan warfare can also boost needed capabilities while acting as a significant deterrent. So we should not underestimate what the deterrent effect of this kind of preparation. And conventional capabilities and their deterrent value will, of course, remain the essential component. But provided that the U.S. and NATO maintain a credible conventional military deterrent, the willingness and preparation of the citizens of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to engage in sustained partisan resistance provides a level of deterrence well beyond what their conventional military capabilities would suggest. So that's my presentation. I'm happy to take questions or comments.
Great. Yes. Thank you for sharing your research with our audience. We do have a few questions coming in. First question, what proportion of the Estonian citizenry identify as ethnically Russian?
So that's actually a complicated question. I think it's somewhere around a quarter that have Russian ancestry, but it's not monolithic. So there are uh, there are some that are very well integrated. Estonia's done a lot of work on that. Younger people, um, you can't tell the difference. They speak fluent English just like Estonians typically do. They go hang out in the same hipster bars in Teleskivi, and they're fully integrated. Then there are some older people that remember the Soviet time when actually being a Russian speaker was sort of a privileged status, and they maybe never learned Estonian, and it's difficult for them to integrate. Um, uh, they, a huge amount of the Russian speakers do have Estonian citizenship now, and there's a middle ground. There's some that maybe identify culturally as Russian, and they maybe live mostly with Russian speaking friends and in that environment, but they've a lot of them have grown up in Estonia, and they know, um, they identify as with their country, and so maybe they watch Russian media, but it's not. I read an article that was very interesting about Narva, which is a town on the border that used to be mostly ethnically Estonian, but then in World War II it got bombed, and the Soviets didn't let the refugees back afterwards, and so it's now mostly Russian speaking. And they're right there on the border. You can see Russia from across the Narva River. And a lot of people listen to, watch Russian media. They may even have a sort of patriotic attachment to Russia in a maybe non-nation state way, but in a cultural way. Like, well, they like the idea of a strong Russia, but there was one man that was interviewed that they said, he kind of, poo-pooed the notion that Putin was a threat, and this was years ago. But then they said, well, what would happen if the Russians were to invade? He said, oh, well, we would fight them. And so he was sort of pro-Russia right up to the point where you say, well, what if the Russians come over the river? And I think the Russian speaking Estonians it's a double-edged sword, because the Russians talk about saving their compatriots, and they often criticize Estonia's nationality policies, because if you or your ancestors were not a citizen of the Republic of Estonia before the occupation, you have to apply for citizenship, and that involves a language exam. So they didn't automatically give citizenship to people who came in during the occupation, and they're sometimes criticized for that. But on the other hand, the Russian speakers in Estonia have a better standard of living than Russians in Russia, and they may have family members there, so they know that, and their family in Russia knows that, and so they don't need saving. They to a certain extent, it's a problem for the Putin regime, because there are Russians that talk to their family members in Estonia, and even if they have some gripes, they have economic and political freedom that the people in Russia don't have. So it's not a clear-cut issue, and you can overplay the extent to which Russian speakers in Estonia is a problem. It could be used as a pretext by Putin, but it's not. If he thought that the fact that people spoke Russian in eastern Ukraine meant that they would welcome the Russian invaders, that turned out to not be entirely true. It certainly does not apply in Estonia or Latvia. Lithuania has much smaller population of Russian speakers, but they certainly would not be welcomed by the Russian speakers living in Estonia. Certainly not a lot. A lot of them, certainly by the bulk of them, would not.
Thank you. Before I move on to the next question, if you have a question for Mr. Rice, please feel welcome to comment in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The next question I have for you is, what role does Kaliningrad play in Estonia's security defense?
That Kaliningrad is a problem because it's an enclave of Russia that is, if you think about Lithuania, it's bordered on the one side, on the west by Kaliningrad and Poland, and then in the east by Belarus, which currently has a dictator who's allied with Putin. So that's a problem, and it's a problem for when they talk about. I think it was former Estonian President Ilves that coined the term Suvalky Gap. There's that little stretch where Poland and Lithuania share a border. That if you were going to move conventional forces from, say, Germany into the Baltics, they have to pass through this fairly narrow corridor. And you can see a situation where the Russians try to pinch that off between Kaliningrad and Belarus and prevent troops from going by land to mount a defense of the Baltics, which obviously means that in defense planning, you have to consider also reinforcement by air and sea through the Baltic Sea. And like I mentioned, there were those special forces training, and I think those were about airlift of supplies into to individuals in Estonia that would be resisting some kind of invasion or occupation. So yeah, Kaliningrad is a problem, and it obviously plays a big factor into the defense of the Baltics as a whole.
Next question I have here is a two-part question. So I'll ask you the first part first, and then follow up with a second. Apart from NATO, do you think the EU will play a meaningful role in preventing or countering any Russian invasion of Baltic states?
So that's a good question. There's a lot of talk in the EU at times about maybe a European defense force, and the reality is NATO is a fully functioning defense force that involves a lot of EU nations. And in fact, you notice that Sweden and Finland, who are officially neutral and not parts of NATO, they have been doing a lot of joint exercises with NATO. And so effectively, the defense would have to be led by NATO. The EU can play a positive contribution and does. There is and I'm blanking on the name right now, but there's a defense plan where there's sort of funding and joint purchases that help build up the militaries, and that's arguably complementary to NATO, and to the extent that NATO, the EU is able to help get countries, militaries up to snuff and in ways that are interoperable with NATO. That's helpful. Also, just in infrastructure, the EU does a lot of work in infrastructure, and there's the issue of moving troops. A lot of American troops are in Germany, and so whenever you're improving or building the roads and infrastructure, and this is something that they talk about as a contribution. This isn't just an incidental thing. This is something that's consciously thought of. That infrastructure helps move NATO troops to where they need to go. In whether that be Poland, whether that be on the Black Sea, whether that be in the Baltic Sea, EU work on infrastructure helps complement defense.
And the second part of that question, can Russia tolerate the inevitable economic retaliation that would follow an invasion of the Baltic states?
So there are already a lot of sanctions on Russia, and so you would think that they already wouldn't be able to tolerate what they have. It's hard to say what the calculus is in Putin's mind. There's an aspect of nationalism that sometimes supersedes the rational calculation of what your country's needs are. Like and so no, Russia, it would be devastating. But then again, Russia also has, they're building the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and they use their economic links to countries like Germany or the EU as writ large as also a tool. And so they hope that Europe will think, well, we can't afford, what will happen. Although the EU has had good solidarity on some sanctions, and they've hurt Russia But also, if there's the issue of national pride. You know, would they withdraw? And also, Putin's interest is staying in power. And if he suffered a terrible defeat and had to withdraw with his tail between his legs, that could cause problems for his future. So if Russia were to invade or do any kind of operation, I mean, like as I mentioned, they would be incredible blowback beyond the conventional, and it would be even worse than the Donbas situation. I think the way, and so they inevitably would fail, and I think that could lead to a toppling of the Putin regime. But that's not. I think he would sustain it as long as he possibly could, knowing that. But also, that's something he should keep in mind, that if he launches an invasion, it's not going to be successful, and that's going to be a problem for his continuation in power.
The next question here, would you please discuss the potential of Estonia destabilization through Russian economic and energy power, such as gas pipelines, which you just discussed a little bit about, against Estonia and European allies to win without invasion?
Sure. So actually, Estonia is actually a little bit more energy independent than the other Baltics because it has a large reserve of oil shale. Unfortunately, oil shale is even more dirty than coal, so it's kind of on its way out. It's also, interestingly, the sort of economic base of the eastern part of Estonia, where a lot of the Russians live, and so the decline of that industry has meant declining economic standards for them, and that's a problem. And Estonia is working on economic development for them. But they're less reliant on natural gas than the other two Baltic countries. But Lithuania has built a liquid natural gas terminal that is in the port of Klaipėda. And I've seen it, and they're even thinking about expanding it. And it's been actually extremely successful in that they get, last I heard, about half of their natural gas from allies like Norway or even the United States through that liquid natural gas terminal. But that has result is that the gas that they get from Russia, Russia has to offer market rates, because they can't just set the price and demand that they take it. So the gas bullying is a problem for the Baltics. It's probably a bigger problem for Ukraine or other countries, and it's something that, the United States has sanctions against Nord Stream 2, and that's a strong bipartisan support for that in Congress, because of the fact that that would give the Russians the ability to bypass Ukraine and blackmail transit countries. Now, the Baltics aren't transit countries, and I think they're increasingly becoming more energy independent. So it's something to keep an eye on, but it's less of a concern, and they've made a lot of progress in preventing that from becoming a bigger issue in the Baltics.
Thank you. The next question I have is cyber warfare part of Estonia's total defense principle?
Absolutely. The NATO Cyber Defense Center of Excellence is located in Tallinn. There's a large tech sector in Estonia, and they were even working on that before the cyber attacks. But then they were the first country to fend off a major cyber attack, and they kind of got on the map. And so it's ironically, sometimes they talk about being grateful to Russia for attacking them, because they were able to show what they were able to do, and they were able to learn lessons that they were able to apply. So that Center of Excellence is located in Tallinn, and they've issued the Tallinn Manual for about cyber warfare. And so they're sort of a leader in the field of cyber warfare. And of course, it fits into their calculus. And they also have an ambassador at large for cybersecurity or something like that, who kind of goes around and shares their experience with other countries and helps get everybody on the same page. They're a good voice in the EU, talking about cybersecurity and getting all the allies on the same page. So that's definitely a big part of it. Yes.
How much do the Baltics coordinate their plans for resistance with each other?
Quite a bit. So, like I said, the time has passed when it was not coordinated. They do have somewhat different. They have different militaries with somewhat different military needs. So it's not the case that every purchase is a joint purchase, but they do joint purchases to save on economies of scale. So if they all need something, they will go in together and do a joint purchase. And then I also know that then this is where my day job intersects, that there's the Baltic Security Initiative, which Congress required the U.S. military to put together along the line of the Ukraine Security Initiative, where they will do a more kind of concerted look at the future needs of the Baltics. We've been providing security assistance on an annual basis, depending on, we look at the needs each year. This is intended to be a larger, more systematic look at what we need several years going down the road. And there was a joint effort by all three Baltic countries to institute this, and that, of course, then implies that it will be joint effort about what the needs are, and so there's they work together to put the framework of that concept together, and so the Baltic countries are well coordinated with each other, and in fact they sometimes travel together because they recognize that even though they are very distinct cultures and very, very separate countries, they're seen as kind of one entity. And so, for instance, the three presidents traveled together and met with President Trump a few years ago, and they often kind of present a united front, or the foreign ministers will do meetings together, and so yeah, they work very, very closely.
Thank you. And we'll take two more questions. Thank you for your response to all of our attendees' questions. So the next question I have for you is, do you think that a Biden administration policy will differ from the Trump administration policy? And if so, how?
So that's a good question. It's still early in the Biden administration, but I don't think we can expect to see major differences. There's there a lot of the sort of on the a lot of the work with the Baltics has kind of continued. The European Deterrence Initiative funding. I don't think there'll be major changes in Baltic policy. I'm told that Biden is very familiar with the Baltics and has a history of support. So I don't see major changes, but we'll have to see.
And the last question I have here, I think it's a good end question. What can be done to engage more U.S. legislators with the Baltic issues?
So that's an interesting question, considering that I work for a legislator. But I think there has been an increased bipartisan recognition of the threat that Russia faces, and I think that has led, like I said, people who are following these issues could tell, going back into the mid 2000s, that Russia was a problem and that Putin was a problem. Edward Lucas's New Cold War came out in 2008, and that was a year after the Bronze Soldier affair in Estonia. There were early signs, and then there was the invasion of Georgia in 2008. But sort of Americans didn't really pay attention until the issue of election meddling and so forth came up. And so I think a lot of Americans are familiar with it, and so I think legislators will be more receptive to the issues. I think an important point is that these countries have had a lot of experience dealing with Russia. They've dealt with propaganda. They've dealt with the sort of meddling and fake news type situation for a long time, because they unfortunately had 50 years in the Soviet Union where all the news was fake news, and so there's a resilience to Baltic society that America doesn't have. We're sort of naive in that respect. They can, average citizens are better able to identify sort of a propaganda message. And so I think it's not just about what we can do to support the Baltics, which I think is important because they're on the front lines, but also what the Baltics can do to support the United States. And I think that's a message that legislators can hear, that these people have knowledge. They have the Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. They have Riga has the Stratcom Center of Excellence. So they deal with this fake news stuff, and they've done a lot of research and dealt with that. And so those are they're also, their experience and knowledge is a resource that we can use now that there's a bipartisan realization that Russia is a serious problem.
That was a great answer. Thank you. Well, I believe that's all the time that we have this evening. I would like to thank Mr. Rice for joining us and all of you who tuned in here on Zoom and Facebook. If you're interested in attending other upcoming webinar events, supporting IWP, or applying to one of our graduate programs, please go to iwp.edu. Again, that's iwp.edu. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.